Good morning. Good morning. Happy Sunday. Today we celebrate the 30th Sunday of Ordinary Time. This is the last Sunday celebrated in daylight savings time. So if you don't set your clocks back next Saturday night, you'll be either really early for Mass or really late for the 9 o'clock Mass. Today's readings invite us to rejoice in God's action plan of salvation for our lives. He came to save us, and he came to save all of us. In the first reading of Jeremiah, we heard language of hope and rejoicing. Shout with joy for Jacob. Exult at the head of the nations. Proclaim your praise and say, the Lord has delivered his people, the remnant of Israel. This upbeat language was uncharacteristic of Jeremiah's prophecies, which usually focused on doom and gloom. But now we hear Jeremiah anticipating the future restoration of Israel. Again, we heard, the Lord has delivered his people, the remnant of Israel. In other words, those who survived the exile and captivity. And Jeremiah draws special attention to the blind and the lame, as well as expectant mothers. He prophesies, I will gather them from the ends of the world, with the blind and the lame in their midst, the mothers and those with child. These classes of people are the vulnerable or marginalized in society, but they are specifically mentioned and included in the prophecy. Thus, God's salvation is open to everyone, including and especially the vulnerable. And in the second reading, a connection is made with the Israelite high priests and Jesus' priesthood. Remember, the high priest was the people's representative before God. And the first characteristic of the high priest, the passage states, is patience. Patience toward the weak and sinners. And regarding the high priest, the passage says, he is able to deal patiently with the ignorant and the erring. Because Jesus became man, Jesus understands the weaknesses of the flesh and therefore has compassion and patience for us. And it's this compassion that makes him the fitting high priest forever. The second characteristic of the Israelite high priest, the passage goes on to state, is his humility. A high priest never sought out the honor of becoming the high priest. He was elected, much the same way our Pope is chosen. Instead, he took upon himself the high priesthood only when called by God. Thus, all honor and glory belongs to God alone. We saw this when Jesus was crucified. Death on the cross was actually a moment of divine triumph. It was the glorification of the cross, and the cross was not simply a tool of torture. So in the first reading, the restored remnant of Israel, including the vulnerable, were called and included in God's salvation plan. And in the second reading also brings us comfort and joy, because Jesus can understand our weaknesses, because he was called by God to be one of us. So although we are weak and vulnerable, we are rescued and restored through Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. All of us. And now we come to the gospel reading. We have to set the stage just a little bit here. This will be the final miracle of Jesus before his passion. He is in the city of Jericho with his disciples and begins his final journey to Jerusalem, a distance of about 17 miles. And remember, Jesus has told his disciples several times what awaits him in Jerusalem. He will be rejected by his own people, who will hand him over to his enemies, and who in turn will mock him, have him scourged, crown him with thorns, and then crucify him. Jesus is now walking to his death. And suddenly, a blind man cries out from his place by the roadside. He's a beggar with no real home, no place in society, really, and very little hope because of his blindness. And yet, St. Mark is the only gospel writer who gives us the name of this blind beggar. It's Bartimaeus. Because he's a blind beggar, Bartimaeus is in one of the lowest cultural classes of his day. Only lepers were in a lower social class. Think of some of the other men mentioned in the scriptures that were of much higher social status, but remained nameless. The anonymous Pharisees who tested Jesus. Or how about the young rich man who wanted to follow Jesus, but walked sadly away when he could not give up his wealth. Mark wants us to know this man and his situation in life, so that when salvation arrives, we can rejoice, or perhaps empathize with his sufferings and his dreams. Didn't we hear in that first reading, I will gather the blind and the lame and bring them back? And here we have the blind Bartimaeus. And he yells out, Jesus, son of David, have pity on me. And the people tell him to be quiet. Now, I can't really imagine that the crowds walking with Jesus were being orderly and quiet. What was one more voice, really? It's not that Bartimaeus was shouting, but what he was shouting. The title Son of David is a messianic title. Bartimaeus is calling Jesus the Messiah. And those loud cries might draw attention to all of Jesus' enemies who were already plotting to kill him. The crowds didn't want any trouble from the authorities. Bartimaeus, the lowly blind beggar, is the first non-apostle to recognize that Jesus is the Messiah. He sees Jesus for who he really was, the one who has the power to heal the blind and the lame. And Jesus calls Bartimaeus over to him. And the bystanders are thinking, uh-oh, Bartimaeus is in trouble. They say, take courage, get up, Jesus is calling you. And Bartimaeus jumps up, and the passage then says, throws aside his cloak. This indicates that Bartimaeus had complete faith that he would be healed, because a cloak was the most important possession for someone in his condition. The cloak is what kept him warm at night. In essence, it was his home. How was he going to find that cloak again if he couldn't see? Bartimaeus was all in at this time. Then Jesus puts a question to Bartimaeus. What do you want me to do for you? Interesting question, isn't it? Jesus wants to draw out of him a personal response of faith and the trust in the power to heal and make him whole. And then Jesus commends Bartimaeus for recognizing who he is with the eyes of faith. Do we recognize the Lord Jesus with eyes of faith? Or are we too blind in ways? And living in sin makes us spiritually blind. Do we ask Jesus to heal us of any blindness that keeps us from seeing the path that leads us to God, or from accepting the crosses that are coming our way? Do we call out for mercy? The question is as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago. What do you want me to do for you? It's something to ponder and meditate on. And we rejoice, for God is calling all of us to be with him. We too are that remnant being called and gathered. We just have to see with the eyes of faith and believe the way Bartimaeus did. We need to be all in.